On the 25th of July, 1940, the map of Europe closed around Switzerland. France had surrendered 5 weeks earlier. Every border the country possessed now touched German or Italian control, and every road out ran through territory belonging to one of two men who had recently demonstrated what they did with small neutral states. What the Axis wanted was not the country, it was the tunnel beneath it. The Gotthard rail line, bored through the granite of the Central Alps and running from Schöllenen in the north to Airolo in the south, was the shortest heavy freight artery between German industry and Italian ports. Coal moved south along it. Iron and grain moved north. No alternative crossing carried comparable tonnage, and no army could improvise one, because the mountains that made the route valuable were precisely the mountains that made it irreplaceable. Swiss engineers had already prepared the answer. Explosive charges sat in chambers cut into the tunnel's approaches, the viaducts, the bridges of the Schöllenen. The corridor could be closed permanently within hours by the people who held it. That was the whole of the position. The thing worth invading for was the thing that would not survive an invasion. Mountains are not walls. This is the first thing to understand about the Alps, and the thing most easily lost when they are drawn on a map as a solid band of shading between northern Europe and the Mediterranean. A range is a set of ridges, and ridges have low points, and low points can be walked. The Alps had been crossed by people carrying goods for thousands of years before anyone thought to write about it. The body recovered from the Ötztal ice in 1991 of a man who died at roughly 3,200 meters in the late 4th millennium BC was found on a saddle between valleys, equipped and provisioned, which is to say, he was in transit rather than lost on a summit. So the question was never whether the Alps could be crossed. It was where, at what cost, in what season, and, the question that would matter more than any of the others, under whose authority. A pass is a compound problem. Height determines how many months of the year it is open, and how many pack animals die on it. Gradient determines whether goods travel on backs, on mules, or on wheels, and each of those is a different economy. Length of approach determines how many nights of shelter, forage, and tolls sit between the last town on one side and the first town on the other, and the shape of the valleys leading up to the saddle determines something less obvious and more consequential, whether a route can be closed and by how many men. Measured against those criteria, the Roman world had made its choices early and stuck to them. The Great St. Bernard, at 2,469 meters, carried the road the Romans called the route over the Mons Povaninus, linking the Rhone Valley to the Aosta Valley and onward to the Po Plain. It is high and it is bleak, and it was used heavily enough that the summit supported a shrine to Jupiter Povaninus for centuries. Excavations there have recovered coins in the thousands and bronze votive plaques inscribed by travelers who had made it over and wished to record their gratitude. That is what a working pass looks like in the archaeological record. Not a road, but the debris of relief. Further east, the Septimer and the Julier carried traffic from the upper Rhine Valley into the Italian lakes, again with Roman period remains along their lines. And east again lay the Brenner, at roughly 1,370 meters the lowest of the major crossings, snow-free for far more of the year than anything to its west, and gentle enough that carts could use it when the others could not. The Brenner was the crossing that mattered to emperors. When the German kings of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries went south to be crowned in Rome or to fight the Lombard cities, they went overwhelmingly by the Brenner or by the eastern routes, because those were the passes that could move an army with its baggage. Look at that map of established crossings, and something is missing from the middle of it. Between the Great St. Bernard in the west and the Rhaetian passes in the east lies the Central Massif, the block of granite and gneiss around what is now called the Gotthard, and through the whole of antiquity and the early medieval centuries it carried almost nothing. There is no Roman road over it, there is no summit shrine with 1,000 years of dropped coins. There is no chain of documented tolls, no early monastic hospice, no cluster of place names recording a through route. For the period in which every other viable crossing in the Alps acquired a history, this one has a silence. The silence is strange, because on paper the central route is the best of them. The pass itself sits at about 2,100 meters, lower than the Great St. Bernard and lower than the Septimer. More importantly, it sits on a continental watershed of unusual convenience. The Reuss rises on its northern side and runs down to Lake Lucerne, then to the Aar, then to the Rhine, and eventually to the North Sea. The Ticino rises on its southern side and runs down towards Lake Maggiore, then into the Po and out into the Adriatic. Two of the great river systems of Europe come within a few hours' walk of each other at that point, and rivers in the medieval world were not scenery. They were the cheap way to move heavy things. A merchant crossing the Central Massif could, in principle, load at a Rhineland port, move goods by water almost to the foot of the mountains, carry them over a single saddle, and reload onto water heading for Milan and the Lombard Plain. Every other crossing demanded a longer land journey at one end or the other, or two saddles instead of one. The central route was the shortest line between the German-speaking north and the richest manufacturing region in Europe. It was also, for 1,000 years, effectively unusable. The reason lies about 10 kilometers north of the pass, in a stretch of the Reuss Valley, perhaps 3 kilometers long, where the river has cut down through hard granite into a gorge called the Schöllenen. Above and below it, the valley is a valley, steep but negotiable, with ground a mule can stand on. Inside it, there is no ground. The walls fall to the water at angles that approach the vertical and in places exceed it. The river at the bottom is not a river in any usable sense, but a chute of white water dropping between boulders, unfordable in every season and unbridgeable by the ordinary means available to medieval builders, which were essentially a beam long enough to reach the far side and rock solid enough to rest it on. Nature does not offer a bypass. The slopes above the gorge on both flanks are avalanche ground, swept clean and unstable, and the detours around them are long enough and dangerous enough that they cancel the advantage the route was supposed to provide. This is what geologists and engineers mean when they say a route is blocked. Not that the mountain is too high, but that a single short section of it cannot be walked at all. The consequence was a piece of geography that reads almost as a joke. The valley immediately above the gorge, Ursern, the high basin containing what is now Andermatt and Hospental, was inhabited. It had grazing, it had settlement, and it had been colonized from the south and the east, through the Oberalp and from the direction of the Rhine headwaters, by people connected to the Abbey of Dissentis. Ursern was a working Alpine community whose ties ran the wrong way. It sat directly on the northern approach to the best pass in the Alps, and it had no usable connection to the north at all. The lands of the Reuss Valley below the gorge, around Altdorf and the head of Lake Lucerne, lay a few kilometers away and belonged, functionally, to a different world. That separation is visible in the documentary record by its absence. The archives of the region before the 13th century record local matters, grants of pasture, tithes, disputes between valley communities and distant monastic landlords, and they do not record transit. There is no toll income from a through route because there is no through route. The Valley of Uri, on the northern side, appears in the surviving documents as a peripheral, thinly populated dependency of interest chiefly for its alpine pasture. It was not on the way to anywhere. The solution, when it came, was not a bridge in the sense most people picture. It was two structures, and the less famous of them was the harder achievement. The first was a walkway. Along the western wall of the gorge, where the rock face offered nothing to walk on, builders drove beams horizontally into the granite and laid a plank surface across them, suspended out over the drop. This construction was called the Twerenbrücke, the word coming from the Middle High German Twer, meaning across or athwart, which describes exactly what it was, a path lying crosswise against a cliff rather than resting on ground. It ran for something on the order of 60 meters, wide enough for a laden pack animal with the Reuss directly below. The second was a conventional span across the river itself, a wooden bridge at the point where the gorge narrows enough to be reached. It appears in a document of 1306 under the name Stiebende Brugge, the spraying bridge, which tells you what standing on it was like. Together, these two elements did the whole job. Neither would have been sufficient alone. The walkway got traffic through the section where there was no bank to walk on. The bridge got it from one side of the water to the other. The dating of the work is not precise, but it is reasonably tight. The archaeological and documentary evidence points to construction around 1230 and certainly before 1234, when the political effects begin to show up in charters. Who built it is unknown in the sense that no name survives. What survives is a strong circumstantial case for the Walser, the German-speaking mountain colonists who had been spreading east and south out of the upper Valais through the 12th and 13th centuries, settling high valleys that nobody else wanted and bringing with them an accumulated body of technique for living and building above the tree line. The Ursern Basin above the gorge had received Walser settlement. The skills required, working with timber at altitude, anchoring structures into rock, operating in a place where a mistake is fatal, match what those communities are known to have possessed. That is inference rather than record, and it should be labeled as such. The men who drove the first beams into the Schöllenen wall left no signature. What they left instead is measurable in trade. Consider what the completed route now offered. From the Rhine at Basel, goods moved up the Aar and the Reuss, or overland along their valleys, to the head of Lake Lucerne. A boat carried them the length of the lake to Fluelen, which sits at the mouth of the Reuss Valley. From Fluelen, it was a day-and-a-half's walk south to the gorge, through it on the new walkway and bridge, into Ursern, and up over the saddle. On the far side, the descent ran down the Val Tremola, the Valley of Trembling, named for reasons the gradient makes obvious, to Airolo, and then down the Ticino to Bellinzona and Lake Maggiore, where boats waited to carry the cargo into the Lombard plain and the markets of Milan. One saddle, two navigable water systems. A journey of a few days rather than a few weeks. Against that, every competing crossing suddenly looked like what it was. Longer, or higher, or requiring a second climb, or all three. The goods that moved reflect the logic of the mountains. Northbound came grain, wine, rice, salt, and manufactured cloth from the Lombard cities. Southbound went cattle and cheese from the Alpine pastures, and later hides and leather. The mountain communities were producing protein and fat on ground that could grow nothing else, and exchanging it for carbohydrates and luxuries grown on ground that had no pasture. The pass was the hinge of that exchange, and the traffic across it was continuous enough to support a whole occupational category. The Säumer, the packers, who owned mule trains and held the local right to carry loads across their assigned stretch of route, handing off at fixed points to the packers of the next stretch. That handover system, called the Sust organization after the warehouses where cargo was transferred and stored, is worth pausing on, because it explains a great deal about what followed. Transit was not open. A merchant could not simply hire whoever he liked and drive his own animals over the pass. He had to use the local carriers, at local rates, storing in the local warehouse, under rules the valley communities set for themselves. The route was a piece of infrastructure, and the people who lived along it operated it as a monopoly. The chapel on the southern slope, dedicated to Saint Gotthard of Hildesheim, a bishop who died in 1038 and was canonized in 1131, and who had acquired a reputation as a patron of mountain travelers, gave the crossing the name it has carried ever since. A hospice grew beside it. The presence of both is itself evidence of volume. Nobody builds and staffs a refuge at that altitude for occasional traffic. The route's opening registered immediately in imperial politics, and this is where the record becomes firm. In 1231, Henry VII, King of the Romans and son of the Emperor Frederick II, issued a charter to the men of the Valley of Uri, granting them Reichsfreiheit, imperial immediacy. The term needs unpacking because it is the pivot of everything that follows. Under it, the valley was placed directly under the emperor rather than under any intermediate lord. No count, no duke, no bishop stood between Uri and the crown. In practice, this meant the valley community answered to a distant authority that could rarely enforce anything, and to nobody nearby at all. This was not a reward for loyalty or a gesture of goodwill. It was a transaction about a road. The Hohenstaufen dynasty was locked in a long struggle with the cities of Lombardy and with the papacy, and it needed to move men and messages into Italy. The newly opened central crossing was the fastest line available. What the emperor required was that the people holding the northern approach be committed to keeping it open for him, and not subject to a regional lord who might close it on someone else's instructions. Imperial immediacy bought that. It converted a poor herding valley into a chartered guardian of a strategic corridor. The Habsburgs, who held extensive rights and estates in the region and were accumulating more, had every reason to object, and did. Their interest was precisely the intermediate lordship that the Charter of 1231 cut out. From this point forward, the central question in the region is not who owns the land, which was never worth much, but who exercises authority over the traffic crossing it. Schwyz, the neighboring territory east of the lake, received a comparable grant of imperial immediacy from Frederick II himself in 1240. Unterwalden's position was murkier, and its claims were later and weaker, but it lay in the same orbit and pursued the same status. An asset with no protector attracts claimants, and the mechanism by which claims were pressed in 13th century Europe was the court. Not a courtroom in the modern sense, but the tribunal of a lord, presided over by a judge that lord appointed, applying law that lord interpreted. Whoever controlled the judge controlled the outcome, and whoever controlled the outcome eventually controlled the property. This is the pressure point the valley communities faced, and it explains the shape of the document they produced in response. In August 1291, representatives of the valley communities of Uri, Schwyz, and Nidwalden, the lower half of Unterwalden, put their seals to a Latin agreement now held at Schwyz and known as the Federal Charter. It is a single sheet of parchment. It is not long. And it is, in the most literal sense, not a declaration of independence, a constitution, or a founding proclamation of a country. It is a mutual defense and law enforcement pact between three rural communities, of a type that was common enough in the period that dozens of comparable documents survive from the Alpine region alone. What it contains is worth setting out precisely, because the gap between what it says and what it later came to mean is one of the more instructive things in European history. The signatories bind themselves to assist one another with counsel and with force, at their own expense, against anyone who attacks or injures any of them. They agree that disputes between them will be settled by arbitration among themselves, rather than referred outward. They undertake to accept no judge who has purchased his office, or who is not a resident of the valleys. They provide for the punishment of murderers, arsonists, and thieves, and for the handling of debt claims, in terms that assume the communities will police their own territory without external assistance. The Charter also does something that reads oddly to modern eyes. It explicitly preserves each man's obligations to his lord. There is no repudiation of the Habsburgs, no rejection of the empire, no assertion of sovereignty. The signatories are not saying they have no masters. They are saying that whatever their masters may claim, disputes will be judged locally, by locals, on local terms, and that an attack on one valley is an attack on three. The clause about judges is the operative one. Strip away the medieval phrasing and it is a rule about jurisdiction, and jurisdiction was the instrument by which a lord converted a nominal claim into effective control. An outside judge, appointed by a count who had bought the position or been granted it, could rule on tolls, on inheritance, on the ownership of pasture, on the legitimacy of a warehouse monopoly. The Charter's answer is to refuse the instrument. No purchased office, no non-resident. The transit business would be adjudicated by the people running it. The document opens by noting the malice of the times and the need for security, a stock formula, but one that indicates the signatories believed themselves under specific threat. What that threat was, the parchment does not say. The date is suggestive. Rudolph I of Habsburg, who had been king of the Romans since 1273 and who had spent his reign expanding family holdings across the region, died on the 15th of July that year. The charter is dated to the beginning of August. A royal death opened a succession contest, and succession contests were when local arrangements got tested. It should be said clearly that the Charter of 1291 is not the earliest such agreement in the region and was probably not treated at the time as exceptional. There is an earlier alliance between Uri and Schwyz referenced in a document of 1251. The parchment's later status as a national founding text is a 19th century achievement, a period when European states were busy locating their origins in medieval documents, and the Swiss had an unusually good one to hand. Historians have argued for well over a century about how much weight it can carry. What is not in dispute is that the three communities that sealed it were the three communities controlling the northern approaches to the pass, and that they bound themselves together at the precise moment their control of that approach was worth contesting. The pact was renewed and extended in the decades that followed, and its practical test came in a form the drafters would have recognized. Through the early 14th century, the Habsburgs pressed. The specific quarrel that brought matters to a head involved Schwyz and the Abbey of Einsiedeln, whose long-running dispute over grazing and forest rights escalated in 1314 into an armed raid. Men from Schwyz broke into the monastery, seized property, and took monks prisoner. The abbey was under Habsburg protection. This was, in the language of the time, an unanswerable provocation, and it gave Duke Leopold I of Austria the occasion he wanted. Two other factors sharpened it. The imperial succession of 1314 was disputed between Frederick the Fair of Habsburg and Louis of Bavaria, and the forest communities had backed Louis, the candidate less likely to press claims on them, and Leopold had a strategic interest of his own in the corridor, which by now was carrying enough traffic that its control was a matter of revenue rather than prestige. In November 1315, an Austrian force moved against Schwyz along the shore of the Agersee on a road that ran between the lake on one side and a steep wooded slope on the other, near a place called Morgarten. The account most often cited is that of Johannes von Winterthur, a Franciscan chronicler writing several decades later, whose father had been present. He describes the Austrian column strung out along the narrow track, unable to deploy, struck from above by men rolling rocks and logs down the slope, and then attacked at close quarters with halberds. The knights could not turn, could not charge, and could not retreat past their own rear. Numbers in medieval chronicles are unreliable, and Winterthur's are no exception, but the outcome is not in doubt. The Austrian force was broken, with heavy losses among the mounted nobility, and Leopold escaped. 2 points about Morgarten matter more than the fighting. The first is technical. What defeated the Austrian force was not superior numbers, superior equipment, or superior training. It was the road. A mounted force on a defile, with water on one flank and a slope on the other, has no tactical options, and men who know the ground can convert that into slaughter with tools no more sophisticated than gravity. The valley communities had discovered, in a single afternoon, that the terrain which made their corridor valuable also made it defensible by a population that was small, poor, and unarmored. The second is legal. Within a month of the battle, in December 1315, the three communities met at Brunnen and renewed their alliance, this time in German rather than Latin, and with additional clauses. The renewed pact went beyond the original in one crucial respect. It committed the signatories not to enter into agreements with outside powers without the consent of the others. A defensive league had acquired a foreign policy. Noticing came in the form of applications. Over the 14th century, the Oath League acquired members, and the pattern of who joined and when tells you what the league was actually for. Lucerne came first, in 1332. It was a Habsburg town, and its position was not incidental. It sits at the northwestern end of the lake, at the point where cargo coming down from the pass left the water and continued. Lucerne was the corridor's northern port. Zurich followed in 1351, a wealthy commercial city with its own trading interests and a domestic political crisis that made an external alliance attractive. Glarus and Zug joined in 1352, and Bern, the largest and most militarily capable of them, expanding aggressively westward on its own account in 1353. By the middle of the century, the League had 8 members and had stopped being a compact between mountain valleys. It was now a mixed body of rural communities and walled cities, with divergent economies and, increasingly, divergent ambitions. What held it together was a set of overlapping bilateral treaties rather than any single constitution, which meant it had no central authority and no reliable mechanism for making anyone do anything. Decisions were taken at assemblies called the Tagsatzung, where delegates arrived with instructions from their home communities and left to consult when the instructions ran out. Habsburg attempts to reverse the process continued, and they produced the second demonstration of what the terrain could do. In 1386, Leopold III of Austria moved against Lucerne with a force built around armored knights. The confrontation came on the 9th of July near Sempach, on ground that was not a defile but sloping farmland, and this matters because it removes the explanation that had covered the earlier victory. There was no road here to trap anyone on. The Austrian knights dismounted to fight on foot, in full plate, in July heat, and formed a hedge of leveled lances. What broke them was not gravity but weapons and endurance. The Confederate infantry carried halberds, a shafted weapon roughly 2 meters long combining an axe blade, a spike, and a hook, which gave a man on foot the reach to strike past a lance point and the leverage to pull a mounted or armored opponent down. Once the Austrian formation lost cohesion in ground that broke up its line, the fighting became a series of individual contests between men in heavy plate who were rapidly exhausting themselves and men in little armor who were not. Leopold III was killed. So were a large number of the Austrian nobility, in a battle that was militarily decisive and politically more so, because it removed a generation of the regional aristocracy in an afternoon. Chroniclers of the following century embroidered the event heavily, and the story most associated with it, of a Confederate named Arnold Winkelried gathering an armful of enemy spears into his own body to open a gap in the line, appears in no contemporary account and cannot be verified. It enters the record long afterwards. The battle is documented, the man is not, and the honest position is to say so. 2 years later, at Naffels in 1388, a Glarus force defeated another Austrian expedition in mountain terrain. The Habsburgs concluded a truce shortly afterwards, and then a longer peace, and the direct effort to subdue the League was effectively abandoned. What the Confederates had built by the end of the 14th century deserves to be described as a military system rather than a run of luck, because its components were specific and repeatable. The first component was the weapon mix. Halberds gave close quarters killing power. Alongside them, and increasingly replacing them as the primary arm, came the pike, a shafted spear of 4 to 6 meters, useless individually and formidable in mass. A block of pikemen several thousand strong, marching in a dense square with the front ranks leveled and the rear ranks upright, presented an oncoming enemy with a moving wall of points that cavalry could not penetrate and that infantry could only meet with an identical formation. The second was the training. The pike square depended entirely on men keeping formation while moving, which is difficult, and while being shot at, which is harder. Confederate communities drilled. Militia service was a condition of membership in the community rather than an occupation, and the practice was regular enough that formations could maneuver at speed, a capability most contemporary infantry lacked. which is why the Confederate squares attacked rather than waited. The third was what they did not carry. Confederate forces traveled without significant baggage, without extensive cavalry, and without the siege apparatus that slowed conventional armies. They moved fast, lived off what they carried and what they found, and could appear on a battlefield days before an opponent expected them. The fourth was reputation, and it was the component that would prove most valuable. Word of Sempak traveled. By the 15th century, the Confederate infantry had a standing in European military opinion out of all proportion to the size of the territory that produced it. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in the early 16th century, returned to the Swiss repeatedly in his political and military works, treating their infantry as the model against which others should be measured, and their citizen militia as evidence for his broader argument that armed citizens defend a state better than hired men. Whether he was right about that is a separate question, and one that the following century would answer awkwardly. But the fact that a Florentine secretary analyzing the balance of power in Italy took the military practice of Alpine herding communities as his benchmark indicates how far the reputation had spread. Now, the corridor. Through all of this, the League's territorial expansion was not random. The Confederates pushed south. In 1331, Uri had already begun extending its reach beyond the pass into the Leventina, the valley running down from the summit towards Bellinzona, the southern half of the crossing. The logic was straightforward. Holding one end of a route is worth less than holding both, because whoever controls the far end controls what the traffic pays and where it goes. Through the 15th century, this became a sustained campaign against the Duchy of Milan, which had every reason to resist. The Confederates took and lost the Leventina more than once. They suffered a serious defeat at Arbedo in 1422, where a Confederate force was caught by a much larger Milanese army and cut up badly, a reminder that the system worked best on ground of their own choosing and could fail elsewhere. But the direction of travel did not change. Bellinzona, the fortress town commanding the point where the Ticino Valley opens towards the plain, was fought over across generations and finally secured in the early 16th century. Its three castles still stand above the town, and they were not built by the Confederates, they were built by Milan, precisely to stop what eventually happened. The territories acquired south of the watershed were not admitted as members. They were administered as subject lands, governed by bailiffs sent in rotation from the ruling cantons, who collected revenue and returned home after a fixed term. This was a straightforward imperial arrangement, and it is worth stating plainly because the Confederation's reputation for liberty rested on rights its own subject populations did not possess. The Italian-speaking valleys south of the pass were ruled, not represented, for roughly 3 centuries. The Burgundian plunder was divided badly, but the more consequential discovery was not the treasure, it was the demand. Within a few years of Nancy, every major power with an interest in Italy wanted Confederate infantry and was prepared to pay for it. The valleys had spent 2 centuries developing a military system to defend a trade route. They now found that the system itself was the more marketable product, a commodity that could be exported down the very corridor it had been built to protect, and one that no competitor could easily manufacture. The arrangement that grew up around this was formal, contractual, and remarkably well documented, which distinguishes it from most mercenary activity of the period. The instrument was called a capitulation, a treaty between a foreign ruler and a canton or group of cantons, specifying how many men would be supplied, for what term, at what rate of pay, under whose command, and subject to what conditions. Those conditions mattered. A well-drafted capitulation stipulated that the troops served under their own officers, kept their own discipline and customs, were paid directly rather than through intermediaries, and, the clause that appears repeatedly, could not be required to fight against the Confederation itself. Pay ran through the cantonal authorities, who took a share. A percentage of what a soldier earned in France or Milan or Naples flowed back into the treasury of a mountain community that had almost no other source of cash. The scale was substantial. Across the roughly 3 centuries in which the trade operated at full strength, estimates for the total number of Confederates who served abroad run into the hundreds of thousands. In any given decade of the 16th or 17th century, tens of thousands of men from a population that never exceeded roughly 1 million were under arms in someone else's service. France was the largest and steadiest customer, and the relationship became structural. Successive French kings maintained standing Swiss regiments, and the alliance treaties that guaranteed the supply also guaranteed something the cantons valued more: privileged access to French grain markets and salt. The Alps produce no salt, and a pastoral economy that lives by making cheese cannot function without it. A treaty that traded soldiers for salt and grain was, for a mountain canton, a trade in necessities. The papacy was another customer. The corps raised for Pope Julius II in 1506 survives to this day as the Pontifical Swiss Guard, and its defining event came on the 6th of May, 1527, when the mutinous imperial army sacked Rome. The Guard fought on the steps of St. Peter's while Clement VII was moved along the covered passage to the Castel Sant'Angelo. The great majority of the corps was killed. The date is still the one on which new guardsmen are sworn in. Milan, Venice, Spain, Savoy, the Dutch Republic, and eventually most of the German principalities all bought at various points. Recruiting agents worked the valleys. Officer commands became hereditary in certain families, and those families, the ones who held the capitulations and took a cut of every man they raised, turned into a cantonal aristocracy of a kind the early charters had explicitly been designed to prevent. This is the point at which the corridor economy changes character. Transit revenue had always been collective. Warehouse fees and packing rights belonged to communities and were distributed among their members. Capitulation income was not. It concentrated in the hands of the men who negotiated the contracts, and it created a political class whose wealth depended on foreign relationships rather than local ones. The councils of the cities and the assemblies of the valleys came, over generations, to be dominated by families who drew pensions from Paris. The word pension deserves emphasis because the practice was open. Foreign powers paid retainers directly to influential men to keep the supply of soldiers flowing and to keep the cantons friendly. Contemporary critics called it what it was. The reformer Huldrych Zwingli, preaching at Zurich in the 1520s, attacked the trade repeatedly on the grounds that it sold the sons of the Confederation for the enrichment of their leaders, and Zurich formally prohibited its participation in the mercenary system under his influence. That prohibition was one of the fault lines that would divide the Confederation within a decade. Now, the military consequence, which is where the arithmetic turns cruel. Confederate infantry commanded premium rates because of what the pike square could do. But a weapon system that everyone can see is a weapon system that everyone can copy, and the copying started almost immediately. Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, raised and trained German infantry, the Landsknechte, on explicitly Swiss lines from the 1480s onward. They fought in the same formations, with the same weapons, they were cheaper, and they were available in larger numbers. The result was that within a generation, Confederate squares were meeting formations that mirrored them exactly. Battles between pike blocks of comparable quality had no elegant resolution. They ground forward until one side's front ranks were destroyed and the formation collapsed, and casualties on both sides were severe. The reputation for invincibility had rested partly on facing opponents who could not fight in the same way. That advantage was gone by roughly 1500. Something worse arrived alongside it. Gunpowder had been present on European battlefields for over a century, but the early 16th century saw two developments that changed what it meant for massed infantry. Field artillery became mobile enough to be repositioned during an engagement, and the arquebus became reliable enough to be issued in quantity. Against either of these, the pike square had a specific and fatal vulnerability. It was a dense mass of men who could not disperse without ceasing to be a pike square. A block that scattered was a mob and would be ridden down by cavalry. A block that held formation was the best target on the field. Round shot fired into a formation 20 or 30 ranks deep did not kill one man. It killed a file. The Confederates were aware of this and had no answer that did not involve becoming something other than what they were. Their advantage lay in speed and aggression, closing the distance before the guns could work, and that answer functioned as long as the guns were slow. It stopped functioning as artillery improved. There is a further point, less often made, about what the trade did to the corridor itself. Men who leave a valley for 10 years of foreign service are not driving mules over a pass. The packers' organization, the warehouse system, the whole apparatus of local transit control continued to operate, but the population supporting it was now exporting its most capable young men on multi-year contracts, many of whom did not return. Parish records from the high valleys through this period show the demographic signature clearly enough. Communities with persistent shortages of men in the prime age brackets. Francis I had been King of France for 8 months. He was 20 years old. He had inherited a claim to the Duchy of Milan, and he had crossed the Alps in August 1515 by a route nobody expected, the Col de l'Argentière, a high southern pass that his engineers had made passable for artillery by cutting and leveling ahead of the column. He brought guns with him in numbers that had not previously been moved over the mountains. The Confederate forces holding Milan were divided before the fighting began. Negotiations at Gallarate had produced terms under which the Confederates would withdraw in exchange for a substantial payment, and contingents from several cantons, Bern, Fribourg, Solothurn, and Valais, among them, accepted and began marching home. What remained were the contingents that refused, drawn largely from the central cantons and reinforced by men who had come south for the campaign and were not inclined to be bought off. On the 13th of September, that remaining force moved out of Milan towards the French camp at Marignano, roughly 15 kilometers to the southeast. It was a deliberate choice to attack rather than negotiate, and the tactical reasoning behind it was the reasoning that had worked for a century and a half. Close the distance fast, get inside the range at which artillery is decisive, and let the pike blocks do the rest. The ground did not cooperate. The terrain around Marignano was flat, cultivated land cut by irrigation ditches, the drainage network that made Lombard agriculture productive and made rapid infantry movement across it nearly impossible. The Confederate squares had to break step to cross channels, reform on the far side, and do it again. Every pause was time the French gunners did not have to earn. The French position was prepared. Artillery was sighted to fire across the line of approach. Behind the guns stood German Landsknechte, the imitation that had by now become a peer, and behind them French heavy cavalry under a command that included Pierre Terrail, the Seigneur de Bayard. The first day's fighting ran from late afternoon into darkness. The Confederates reached the guns and overran part of the French artillery line. Then the fighting became what fighting between pike formations always became, a compressed grinding contest in which neither side could disengage, and it continued after sunset in conditions where units could not identify one another. Both armies eventually broke contact and lay down where they stood, within a few hundred meters of each other. The second day decided it. At dawn, the fighting resumed, and in the course of the morning, Venetian forces under Bartolomeo d'Alviano arrived on the field in support of the French. The Confederates, already reduced, now faced a fresh army on their flank. They withdrew towards Milan in formation and under fire, which is itself an indication of what the drill was worth, but they withdrew. Casualty figures for the engagement are reported variously in the sources, and none of them should be treated as precise. The most commonly cited estimate for Confederate dead is in the region of 10,000, against French losses that were also heavy enough that the battle was not the one-sided demonstration it is sometimes described as. What is not disputed is that the Confederation lost a substantial fraction of the men it had put in the field, in about 16 hours of fighting on ground where its methods did not work. Marshal Trivulzio, a Milanese commander with long experience of Italian warfare who had fought in a great many engagements, described Marignano afterwards as a battle of giants and said that all his previous actions had been children's games by comparison. The remark is quoted often, and it is worth noting what it actually concedes. Not that the Confederates were beaten easily, but that beating them cost more than anything he had seen. What followed was more consequential than the battle. In November 1516 at Freiburg, the Confederation and France concluded a treaty that both sides referred to as the Perpetual Peace. Its terms were, for a settlement following a defeat, extraordinarily favorable to the losing party. France paid a very large indemnity, figures in the hundreds of thousands of crowns, and continued to pay pensions. The Confederates kept the territories they held on the southern side of the watershed, including the Leventina and Bellinzona and the surrounding valleys, which is to say they kept the corridor entire. What they gave up was the claim to Milan and to further expansion into the plain. The treaty also contained the clause that gives it its name and its significance. The two parties undertook never to make war on one another and not to assist one another's enemies. Francis I had understood something that a more triumphal settlement would have missed. Destroying the Confederation was not achievable at acceptable cost, and was not desirable in any case, because the thing France actually wanted from the Alps was twofold: soldiers and a secure northern approach to Italy that no rival held. A friendly confederation that supplied the first and guaranteed the second was worth more than a conquered one. The indemnity and the pensions bought both. For the Confederation, the terms resolved a problem that had been building for decades. Expansion southward had always been contested among the members, because the cantons that benefited from it were not the cantons that paid for it. The rural central cantons held the pass and profited from transit and from the subject territories. The western cities, Bern above all, were oriented towards Burgundy and the French frontier and had no interest in Lombardy. The city cantons wanted trade access, the valleys wanted land. Every southern campaign had required assembling an agreement that barely held, and Gallerate had shown how easily it came apart. After 1516, there was no longer anything to agree about. The southern question was closed by treaty. This is the moment that Swiss tradition, and for a long time Swiss official publication, identified as the origin of neutrality. The Federal Department of Defense used the date. A government booklet on neutrality, distributed until recently, traced the practice to it. The formulation that the country has been neutral since Marignano is widely repeated. The formulation is worth examining, because the evidence for it is thinner than its popularity suggests. Not all the cantons were even present at the battle. Several had marched home before it. The Perpetual Peace was a bilateral treaty with France, not a declaration of neutrality towards Europe generally, and the Confederation went on to sign further alliance treaties, most notably the one of 1521 that committed it to supplying France with troops for the next 2.5 centuries. Confederate soldiers fought in essentially every major European war after 1516, in numbers that made the Confederation one of the continent's most significant military suppliers. Huldrych Zwingli had served as a chaplain with Zurich contingents in Italy and had been present at Marignano. His objection to the trade was not abstract. When he became people's priest at the Grossmünster in 1519 and began preaching straight through the New Testament rather than following the liturgical calendar, his theological program and his political one advanced together, Scripture as sole authority and an end to the selling of men. Zurich moved fast. Between 1523 and 1525, the city council abolished the Mass, removed images from the churches, dissolved the monasteries, and converted their revenues to poor relief and education. Basel, Bern, Schaffhausen, and later Geneva and Neuchâtel followed on comparable lines. Bern's adoption in 1528 was decisive in weight, since Bern was the largest territorial power in the Confederation. The central cantons, Uri, Schwyz, Unterwalden, Lucerne, and Zug, did not follow. They remained Catholic, and their reasons were not solely religious. These were the communities that held the pass. Their economy ran on transit revenue, on the subject territories south of the watershed, and on the capitulation income that Zurich was now denouncing as sin. A reformation that abolished the mercenary trade, abolished their cash. A reformation preached from a wealthy commercial city that had spent 2 centuries acquiring influence over the rural valleys looked, from the valleys, like a familiar kind of encroachment wearing a new vocabulary. Armed confrontation came twice. At Kappel in 1529, the 2 sides assembled and then negotiated rather than fought. A settlement remembered partly for an account of soldiers from opposing camps sharing a bowl of milk and bread across the line while their commanders talked. At Kappel again in October 1531, the negotiation did not happen. A Catholic force caught a smaller Zurich army before it had concentrated and destroyed it. Zwingli was among the dead. He had come with the troops as chaplain and was killed on the field at the age of 47. The peace that followed, the Second Territorial Peace of 1531, established the principle that mattered. Each canton would determine religious practice within its own territory, and no canton would interfere in another's. This is worth stating in plain terms, because it is one of the more remarkable arrangements of the period. Nearly a century before the Peace of Westphalia applied a similar formula to Germany, and while France was moving towards the wars of religion that would kill hundreds of thousands, 13 small polities, sharing a border and a common assembly, agreed to stop trying to convert one another and to leave the question permanently unresolved. They did not do it out of tolerance. There was very little of that available. They did it because the alternative was the dissolution of the Confederation. And dissolution meant that the corridor, the asset every member had some stake in, the route that fed the cities and enriched the valleys, would fall to whichever outside power arrived first. The immediate consequence was paralysis in foreign policy, and paralysis turned out to be productive. The Tagsatzung had never had strong central authority. After 1531, it had almost none on any question touching religion, which in 16th century Europe meant almost every question of alliance. Zurich and Bern would not commit to Catholic Spain or to the Emperor. Lucerne and the central cantons would not commit to a Protestant coalition. The Confederation could reach agreement on almost nothing external, and so it agreed to almost nothing external. Non-participation arrived, in other words, not as principle but as deadlock. What converted deadlock into practice was a set of agreements the cantons made among themselves. These were the defensionale arrangements, developed across the later 16th and 17th centuries and given their most complete form in the defensionale of Will in 1647. Their content was specific. The cantons undertook to raise, equip, and command a common force for the defense of the Confederation's borders, with fixed contingent quotas from each member, and to use it for nothing else. A shared army with a purely territorial mandate. Catholic and Protestant cantons that would not pray together agreed to garrison a frontier together. This was the machinery. It bound members militarily while removing the offensive option, and it did so at exactly the moment the surrounding continent tore itself apart. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, killed a proportion of the German population that historians still debate, but which was catastrophic by any estimate. Regions of central Germany lost between a third and half their inhabitants. Armies moved across the Holy Roman Empire for a generation, living off the country because there was no other way to feed them. The Confederation did not join, and the Defensionale is a substantial part of the reason it was not dragged in. Its frontier was garrisoned. Its passes could be closed by people who had demonstrated repeatedly that they knew how, and there was no faction inside it capable of committing the whole to either side. There was one significant exception, and it deserves mention because it shows how narrow the margin was. The Valtellina. The Alpine Valley running east from Lake Como, which carried the route linking Habsburg-Milan to Habsburg, Austria, was controlled by the 3 leagues of Graubünden, an associate of the Confederation rather than a full member. It became a theater of the war. In 1620, a massacre of Protestants there triggered years of intervention by Spain, France, and Austria in turn. The Valtellina was fought over because it was a strategic corridor whose holders could not defend it. That is the counterfactual for the Gotthard, running in real time 100 kilometers to the east. The war's settlement gave the Confederation something it had never formally possessed. At the negotiations concluding the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Basel's mayor Johann Rudolf Wettstein pressed for and obtained the exemption of the Confederation and its cities from the jurisdiction of the imperial courts. The practical independence secured in 1499 became legal separation from the Holy Roman Empire. The Confederation now existed, in the eyes of European diplomacy, as something outside the imperial structure, uncommitted and, this being the operative fact, in possession of the central Alpine crossing. The internal cost of the arrangement should not be minimized. Confessional division did not end in 1531, it went dormant and periodically woke. The Villmergen Wars of 1656 and 1712 were both fought between Catholic and Protestant cantons over the balance of power in shared territories. The second ended with Protestant Bern and Zurich dominant, and it settled the internal balance for over a century, but it settled it by force. Timber in a gorge has a predictable life. Water hits it constantly, freezes inside it in winter, and expands. Rockfall breaks it. Avalanches take out whole sections. The wooden ledge on the cliff face required continuous maintenance and periodic complete rebuilding, and it failed catastrophically often enough that Uri's accounts show the expense as a recurring burden rather than an occasional one. In 1707, a flood destroyed it again. The authorities of Uri decided not to rebuild in wood. They decided to go through the mountain instead. The man they hired was Pietro Moratini, born in 1660 in the Val Maggia, on the southern side of the watershed. He was a military engineer by training and by career. He had worked on fortifications in French service under the school of thinking that Vauban had made dominant, which meant he understood earthworks, siting, and the practical business of moving large volumes of rock. Fortress engineering in the late 17th century was among the most technically demanding professions in Europe, and it was one of the few that routinely required blasting. Black powder had been used in mining since the 17th century, notably in Hungarian and German ore workings, and the technique was known but far from routine in civil construction. What it involved was drilling a hole into rock by hand, a man holding a steel bit while another struck it with a hammer, rotating between blows, to a depth of perhaps half a meter, packing it with powder, sealing it, and lighting a fuse. Each shot removed a small volume. Progress was measured in centimeters per day. Moratini's task was to drive a passage through the Kirchberg, the rock spur that formed the worst section of the route, at a point where going around had never been possible. The tunnel he cut was roughly 60 meters long, and initially just large enough for a laden pack animal, something under 2.5 meters high and wide. Work ran through 1707 and into 1708. The result was called the Urnerloch, the Uri hole, and it appears to be the earliest road tunnel constructed in the Alps. That claim rests on the absence of any documented earlier example rather than on positive proof, and it should be held with appropriate care. What is certain is that no comparable structure on an Alpine route is attested before it. The engineering significance is easy to understate and worth spelling out. A wooden ledge is a structure attached to a mountain. It has a lifespan, an owner, a maintenance schedule, and a failure mode. A tunnel is a modification of the mountain itself. Once cut, it does not rot, does not need annual rebuilding, and cannot be swept away by avalanche or flood. Mauritania converted the corridor's single most fragile component into its most permanent one, and he did it for a contract price that Uri's records put at several thousand crowns, expensive, but a fraction of what perpetual reconstruction cost. The traffic effects followed within a generation. The route through the gorge was now stable enough and wide enough that the whole crossing could be progressively upgraded, and it was. The first carriage recorded as crossing the pass made the journey in 1775, which is a specific and revealing date. It means that for the preceding 5.5 centuries, every item carried over the Central Alps had traveled on the back of a mule or a man. Wheels changed the economics completely. A pack mule carries something in the region of 100 kilograms. A cart on a graded road carries several times that with the same animal. The volume of goods that could cross per season multiplied, and the cost per unit fell. It is worth standing in the gorge at this period, because the sensory reality of the place explains why it took 500 years to fix. Walking north out of Andermatt towards the tunnel mouth, you would hear the Reuss before you saw it, a continuous roar off the rock walls loud enough to make conversation difficult, with cold spray hanging in the air. The passage itself was unlit, cut rough, and just tall enough that a loaded animal cleared the roof. Then the bridge, wet with permanent mist, with the water dropping away invisibly below. The rebuilding did not stop with the tunnel. The stone bridge of 1595, which had replaced the medieval wooden span, was itself supplemented by a higher and wider structure in the 1820s as the road was upgraded for vehicles. Between 1818 and 1836, the canton of Uri, with financial help from other cantons, because the benefit was general, carried out a comprehensive reconstruction of the pass road along its whole length. The southern descent received the treatment that is still visible today. The Tremola Road, a sequence of switchbacks cobbled in stone, descending the steep face towards Airolo in a series of hairpins that remain in use. It is among the longest surviving historic road monuments in the country, and it was built for horse-drawn traffic that had only just become possible. The consequence was that by the 1830s, the central crossing had regained the primacy it had lost during the centuries when the gorge limited its capacity. Other Alpine roads were being upgraded in the same period. Napoleon's engineers had rebuilt the Simplon between 1801 and 1805, and the Splugen and San Bernardino were improved in the 1820s. But the central route's fundamental advantage of a single low saddle between two river systems reasserted itself once the physical bottleneck was removed. Now the strategic consequence, which points in an uncomfortable direction. Everything Mauritania and his successors did made the corridor better. Better meant more valuable meant more worth taking. For as long as the route was a mule track through an impassable gorge, an army could not use it in any serious way. No artillery train, no supply wagons, nothing that moved on wheels. It was a merchant's road, and merchants' roads are not strategic objectives. A road that carries carriages carries guns. The Confederation had spent the 17th century building a defensive system on the assumption that its terrain did the heavy work. The defensionale arrangements presumed that the frontier could be held because the ways through it were few and difficult. Every improvement to the pass road reduced the difficulty and increased the prize. There is a further problem, and it was internal. The Confederation of the 18th century was not the association of armed communities that had beaten the Habsburgs. It had ossified. The cities were governed by closed oligarchies of patrician families. In Bern, a few dozen families held effective control of a territory containing several 100,000 people. The rural cantons were dominated by the mercenary contracting dynasties. Subject territories, including the Italian-speaking valleys along the southern half of the corridor and the Vaud under Bernese rule, had no political rights whatever. French forces crossed the frontier in March 1798. The pretext was assistance to reformers in the Vaud, the French-speaking territory that Bern had ruled as a subject land for 2.5 centuries, and whose population had no reason to defend Bernese rule. The Vaud fell without resistance. Bern's own forces fought a short campaign and were beaten within a fortnight. Freiburg and Solothurn surrendered. The city treasury of Bern, one of the largest accumulations of state capital in Europe, built on centuries of pensions and land revenue, was seized and shipped to France, where a portion of it financed the expedition Bonaparte was then preparing for Egypt. The central cantons resisted longer and harder. Nidwalden in particular fought a bitter defense in September that ended with the burning of villages and several hundred civilian dead. But there was no Confederate army, no unified command, and no plan, and the outcome was never in doubt. What replaced the Confederation was the Helvetic Republic, a centralized unitary state written on the French model and imposed from outside. It abolished the cantons as sovereign entities, abolished the subject territories, granted legal equality, and installed a national government answerable, in practice, to Paris. Many of its reforms were ones that liberal Swiss had themselves argued for. Almost none of them were welcome in the form they arrived. The clause that matters here was in the Treaty of Alliance France imposed in August 1798. It required the Helvetic Republic to permit the passage of French troops and to place its territory at French disposal. Neutrality was not merely suspended, it was contractually surrendered. The Confederation's own rule against separate foreign commitments, written after Morgarten, had survived 480 years and was extinguished by a treaty its signatories had no power to refuse. The point of the exercise was the passes. France's strategic problem in Italy was access, and holding the Swiss crossings solved it. It also denied them to Austria, whose forces in northern Italy now had no direct route to their allies in Germany. The following year, the coalition attempted to take them back. The campaign of 1799 turned the whole of the Central Alps into a battlefield, and the terrain that had kept armies out for 5 centuries became the ground they fought over. Austrian and Russian forces pushed the French out of much of northern Italy through the spring and summer. In eastern Switzerland, French and Austrian armies fought 2 major engagements around Zurich, and in September, the coalition attempted a maneuver that depended entirely on the corridor. Alexander Suvorov, the Russian commander, was ordered to bring his army north from Italy over the pass, join the Russian force under Rimsky-Korsakov near Zurich, and destroy the French army in Switzerland. Suvorov was 69 years old and had never lost a battle. His army numbered roughly 21,000 men. He had no maps worth the name, mules that had been promised and did not arrive in sufficient numbers, and no experience of Alpine operations. He began the ascent from Airolo on the 24th of September. The French, under Claude Lecourbe, held the pass with a much smaller force and fought a delaying action up the southern slope. Suvorov's men took the summit at heavy cost and began the descent into the Reuss Valley. Then they reached the gorge. Lecourbe's engineers had done the obvious thing. They had destroyed the crossing. A section of the Devil's Bridge was down, and French troops held the northern side and the mouth of the tunnel. The Russian column arrived at a 3-kilometer defile with vertical walls, a broken bridge, and a defended 60-meter hole in the rock as the only way forward. What followed on the 25th of September is documented from both sides. A Russian detachment forced the tunnel, others climbed down into the gorge and crossed the river below the bridge under fire, an action that killed a substantial number of men in the water. On the far side, they took the French position from behind. The gap in the bridge was then closed by pulling down a nearby structure, lashing the beams together with officers' sashes and whatever rope was available, and running men across the improvised span. They got through. It is a genuinely remarkable feat of arms, and it accomplished nothing, because while Suvorov was fighting his way north, Massena had already destroyed Rimsky-Korsakov's army at Zurich on the 25th and 26th of September. The force Suvorov was marching to join no longer existed. He emerged from the Reuss Valley to find the French army waiting for him and his line of advance closed. What followed was a fighting retreat eastward over the Progel and the Panixer passes, in early snow, with wounded, abandoned, and pack animals killed for food. He brought perhaps 14,000 men out. Russia withdrew from the coalition shortly afterwards. For the country the campaign was passing through, the year was among the worst in its history. Armies of three powers lived off a landscape that had no surplus to give. Requisition stripped the valleys of livestock, grain, and fodder. Villages burned. The Helvetic Republic, which had no functioning tax system, could neither feed its people nor protect them, and famine followed in the winter. The lesson the episode delivered was precise, and it is the point of the whole chapter. Neutrality, as the Confederation had practiced it for 250 years, was not a legal status. It was a physical capability. It worked because the cantons could close the passes and had shown they would. When the Helvetic Republic was created, that capability was transferred to France, and the moment it was in someone else's hands, the corridor stopped being a shield and became a target. Every army in the region converged on it. The corollary is equally clear, and it was demonstrated in the Gorge on the 25th of September. A defended choke point is enormously expensive to force. Lecourbe's small force, holding a broken bridge and a tunnel, cost one of the finest armies in Europe hundreds of casualties and a day it did not have. That is what the terrain was worth to whoever held it. The Helvetic Republic staggered on for 5 years and never functioned. Coups succeeded one another. The cantons refused to accept abolition, and by 1802, a general revolt against the central government forced French troops to return. Bonaparte, by now first consul, had concluded that a centralized Switzerland was ungovernable and therefore useless to him. His Act of Mediation of 1803 restored the cantons as the basis of the state, added 6 new ones, including Ticino, formed from the former subject valleys of the southern corridor, and the Vaud, and created a looser federal structure. It was an improvement, and it was still a French protectorate, obliged to supply 16,000 troops to the imperial armies. Those troops served. Swiss regiments were part of the force that entered Russia in 1812, and at the crossing of the Berezina in November, they held the rearguard during the retreat. Of roughly 9,000 Swiss who went east, a few hundred came back. When Napoleon's empire collapsed, the question of what to do with the Alps came back onto the table, and this time the powers deciding it had watched, for 15 years, what happened when the central corridor belonged to somebody. The Swiss arrived in Vienna badly organized, and it very nearly cost them. The Congress opened in November 1814 and ran until June of the following year, its purpose being to settle the shape of Europe after 23 years of war. The Confederation sent 3 representatives. So, separately, did several individual cantons, along with regions and interest groups pursuing their own claims, the Vaud and Aargau fighting to avoid being handed back to Bern, Bern demanding exactly that, Valais and Geneva and Neuchâtel each pressing distinct cases. The impression given to the assembled powers was of a body that could not speak with one voice about anything, which was accurate. Internally, the country had spent the previous year on the edge of civil war over whether the restored cantons could reclaim their pre-revolutionary subject territories. What saved the Swiss position was that the powers were not primarily interested in what the Swiss wanted. They were interested in the passes, and they had all learned the same lesson. Consider the problem from the table's perspective. The central Alpine crossings, together with the western routes through Valais and the eastern ones through Graubünden, controlled military movement between France, the German states, and northern Italy. Whoever held them could move an army into Lombardy or into southern Germany at will, and could deny the same movement to everyone else. France had demonstrated this from 1798 onward. There were only 3 possible dispositions. France could hold them, which Austria and the coalition had just fought a generation of war to prevent. Austria could hold them, which France would never accept, and which would have given Vienna a dominant position in Italy and southern Germany simultaneously. Or nobody could hold them. The third option required a state that was territorially intact, internally capable of closing its own frontiers, and permanently barred from allying with anyone. Such a state existed and had a 400-year record of behaving that way when left alone. The declaration, adopted on the 20th of March 1815, issued while the Congress was in some disarray at the news that Napoleon had returned to France, recorded the power's acknowledgement that the general interest required the Helvetic states to enjoy the benefit of perpetual neutrality, and guaranteed the integrity of the 22 cantons. The language of that document repays attention. The neutrality is justified by the general interest of Europe, not by any Swiss right or Swiss request. It is a European security arrangement that happens to be located in Switzerland. The country was not granted neutrality as a favor. It was assigned neutrality as a function. The guarantee was confirmed at Paris on the 20th of November, 1815, after Waterloo, by Austria, Britain, Prussia, Russia, France, and Portugal. The signatories undertook to recognize and guarantee the perpetual neutrality of the Confederation and the inviolability of its territory. The Confederation gave something up in return, and the concession is usually underplayed. Perpetual neutrality meant no alliances, ever, including defensive ones. It meant the country's foreign policy options were permanently constrained by treaty, and the territorial settlement fixed the borders essentially where they stood, closing off expansion in any direction for good. There was a strategic addition. The northern part of Savoy, adjoining Geneva, was neutralized as well. In the event of war, Swiss forces were entitled to occupy it to protect the approaches to Geneva. This clause, which persisted into the 20th century, indicates how specifically the arrangement was about controlling routes rather than about Swiss sovereignty in the abstract. Two further pieces of business closed the era. The first was mercenary service. The Congress did not abolish it, and the trade continued for another generation under new capitulations. Swiss regiments served the restored Bourbons, the Papal States, Naples, and Spain. What ended it was domestic. The federal constitution eventually prohibited the cantons from concluding military capitulations with foreign powers, and a federal law of 1859 banned foreign military service outright. The trade that had funded the cantons for 300 years was closed by legislation. Its final significant episode came in Paris in July 1830, when the Swiss Guard of Charles X was among the forces that fired on the crowds during the Revolution, an event that did lasting damage to the trade's reputation at home. The Pontifical Guard survives as the single exception, protected by a specific carve-out. The second was the internal settlement, and it required a war. The restored cantonal system of 1815 was a compromise nobody liked. Liberals in the industrializing Protestant cantons wanted a centralized federal state with free movement, a single currency, and a common market. Conservatives in the Catholic rural cantons wanted the old sovereignty preserved. Through the 1830s, the liberal cantons revised their own constitutions and moved against the monasteries. And in 1845, 7 Catholic cantons, including the central ones that held the pass, formed a separate defensive league, the Sonderbund. The Tagsatzung declared the league unconstitutional, and, in November 1847, sent a federal army to dissolve it. The campaign lasted under a month. The federal commander, Guillaume-Henri Dufour, conducted it with explicit instructions to his officers to minimize casualties, spare civilians, and protect prisoners and the wounded. Total deaths on both sides are generally put at fewer than 150. This restraint was not sentimental. Dufour understood that a war of extermination against the Catholic cantons would invite the intervention of Austria and France, both of whom were watching, and both of whom had grounds to act as guarantors of the 1815 settlement. Speed and mercy were the strategy. The revolutions that broke out across Europe in 1848 then removed any prospect of intervention entirely. The Federal Constitution of 1848 created the state that exists today: a bicameral parliament, a collective executive, a single currency, internal free trade, and, critically for the corridor, federal authority over posts, customs, and the construction of major infrastructure. Cantonal tolls on internal trade were abolished. The route from Basel to Bellinzona became, for the first time in 6 centuries, a single jurisdiction for the purposes of moving goods. Dufour is worth one further note. In 1863, he chaired the Geneva Conference that established the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the following year presided over the diplomatic gathering that produced the first Geneva Convention. The emblem adopted, a red cross on white, the Swiss flag reversed, was chosen as a neutral marker precisely because of what the colors had come to signify. That is the shape of what neutrality had become by the middle of the 19th century. It was no longer an inability to agree, as it had been after the Reformation, nor merely a physical capability, as it had been before 1798. It was a legal status guaranteed by the great powers, defended by a federal army, and increasingly monetized as a service, a place where enemies could meet, negotiate, and register the agreements they made. And the state that now held the corridor had, for the first time, the constitutional authority and the tax base to do something with it that no canton had ever been able to attempt. What no canton had ever been able to attempt was to stop climbing the mountain and go under it. The reason was arithmetic. Railways had transformed European freight by the 1850s, and their defining limitation was gradient. A locomotive of the period could pull a heavy train up an incline of perhaps 2.5%. The pass road climbs from Schöllenen to the summit at gradients several times that. There was no route over the mountain that a railway could use, and this was not a matter of engineering effort but of physics. The consequence was visible in the traffic figures. Freight that had crossed the Central Alps for 6 centuries began going elsewhere, around the mountains entirely by sea, or over the Brenner, where a railway opened in 1867, or through the Mont Cenis tunnel between France and Italy, which opened in 1871 and demonstrated that long tunneling was possible. A corridor that cannot carry the dominant freight technology of its age is not a corridor. It is scenery. The pass road, rebuilt at great expense 2 generations earlier, was becoming a tourist route. The engineer who forced the alternative was Louis Favre, a Genevan contractor with a record of tunnel work who won the concession in 1872. The terms he accepted were brutal, and he accepted them because the competition was fierce. A fixed price, a completion deadline of 8 years, and escalating financial penalties for every day of delay, with total forfeiture of his security beyond a certain point. He was, in effect, betting his firm and his fortune on a schedule. The tunnel was to run roughly 15 kilometers from Schöllenen in the north to Airolo in the south, driven from both ends simultaneously and meeting in the middle. Financing came from the German Empire, the Kingdom of Italy, and the Swiss Confederation together, which is itself the point. The 2 industrial powers on either side of the Alps were paying for a route through a country that would never be able to use it against them. Work began in 1872 and immediately encountered the conditions that make deep tunneling different from any other kind of construction. Rock temperature rises with depth. Under a mountain with more than 1.5 kilometers of material above the bore, working temperatures reached and exceeded 30 degrees, and the air was saturated with humidity, rock dust, and the smoke of blasting powder. Ventilation was primitive. Groundwater entered under pressure, sometimes in volumes that flooded the working face. The drilling was mechanical, compressed air rock drills powered by water turbines at the portals, which was the technology that made a tunnel of this length conceivable at all. The workforce was largely Italian, recruited from the south, and housed in barracks at the portals in conditions that were crowded and insanitary. The mortality is documented, and it was severe. Contemporary records attribute close to 200 deaths directly to the works: rockfall, blasting accidents, machinery, and the transport of spoil. Deaths from disease among the workforce and in the settlements around the portals were considerably higher. Ankylostomiasis, an intestinal parasite spread in the warm, wet conditions underground, was identified in the tunnel workers and became a subject of medical study. The epidemic that spread from the works was serious enough to attract international attention. Conditions produced a strike at Schöllenen in July 1875 over pay and hours. Cantonal troops were called in, shots were fired, and 4 workers were killed. The men who died had no political rights in the country whose infrastructure they were building. Favre did not see the tunnel finished. He died of a heart attack inside the works on the 19th of July, 1879, in the northern Bore at the age of 52. His firm was by then deep into penalty territory and effectively ruined. The two headings met on the 29th of February, 1880, with an alignment error small enough to be remarkable given the surveying methods available. The tunnel opened to traffic on the 1st of June, 1882. Its effect on the corridor was immediate and total. The crossing that had taken the better part of a week by road now took roughly 9 hours. Freight capacity increased by an order of magnitude. The central route recovered its position not as one Alpine crossing among several, but as the principal north-south freight artery of continental Europe. Between the tunnel's authorization and its opening, the guarantee that protected it was tested for the first time. The Franco-Prussian War broke out in July 1870. The Confederation mobilized its army to the western frontier under Hans Herzog with a defensive mandate. Neither belligerent violated the border. That is unremarkable in itself. What happened at the end of the war is not. By late January 1871, the French Army of the East under Charles Denis Bourbaki had been driven against the Swiss frontier in the Jura and had nowhere left to go. Bourbaki attempted suicide on the 26th of January. His successor, Justin Clinchant, negotiated with Herzog, and on the 1st of February, a convention was signed at Les Verrières, under which the army crossed into Switzerland and laid down its arms. Roughly 87,000 men crossed, with horses and equipment, in the middle of an Alpine winter, into a country of about 2.5 million people. They surrendered their weapons at the border and were distributed across virtually every canton, quartered in barracks, schools, factories, and private houses. Around 1,700 died of wounds, exhaustion, and disease. The rest were held until March and then repatriated, and the French government was subsequently billed for their maintenance, an invoice it paid. This was the guarantee functioning exactly as its authors had intended. A neutral state absorbed an entire defeated army and removed it from the war, preventing its destruction and preventing its escape to fight again. The operation was conducted under the terms of the Geneva Convention that Swiss diplomacy had helped create 7 years earlier. Edouard Castres later painted the crossing as an enormous circular panorama, still displayed at Lucerne, which is how the country chose to remember it. The formal codification followed at The Hague. The Convention of 1907, respecting the rights and duties of neutral powers in war, on land, set out in treaty language what had previously been custom. A neutral's territory is inviolable. Belligerents may not move troops or supplies across it. A neutral must intern belligerent troops who enter, and must apply its rules impartially to all sides. Switzerland signed. The document turned a bespoke great power arrangement into general international law, and it gave the country something valuable, a legal framework in which its position was not a privilege granted by 6 signatories, but a recognized category of state. By 1914, the picture was coherent for the first time in 600 years. A federal state held the corridor end to end. A tunnel carried the freight of 2 empires beneath it. A guarantee protected it, a convention defined its obligations, and an army existed to enforce them. What none of that resolved was the question the arrangement had always begged. A route that both sides in a European war depend on is not neutral in its effects, whatever the law says about its status. Someone benefits from every ton that moves. That question would be asked in earnest twice within 31 years. The first asking came in 1914, and the answer was mixed. The country mobilized, elected Ulrich Wille as general, and held its borders for 4 years without being invaded. It also came close to fracturing along its own linguistic seams. German-speaking Switzerland leaned towards the Central Powers, French-speaking Switzerland towards the Entente, and the divergence was open enough in the press to alarm the federal government. A scandal in 1915, when 2 senior staff officers were found to have passed intelligence to Austria and Germany, confirmed that the sympathies ran into the army itself. Against that, Geneva became the principal machinery of humanitarian exchange in Europe. The International Committee of the Red Cross established a prisoner of war agency that handled millions of inquiries and card records, tracing men across the fronts. Switzerland received tens of thousands of severely wounded prisoners from both sides for internment and convalescence, under agreements negotiated with all belligerents. The state that could not agree with itself about the war ran the mechanism through which the war's participants communicated about their captives. The second asking, from 1939, was harder, and it produced the record that Switzerland has spent the past several decades examining. The military position after June 1940 has already been set out. What has not is the economic position, and the economics are where the difficulty lies. A landlocked country of roughly 4 million people, entirely surrounded by 2 belligerent powers, imports its food, its fuel, and its raw materials, or it starves. Every calorie and every ton of coal that entered Switzerland between 1940 and 1944 arrived across, or with the permission of, Axis-controlled territory. That is the constraint inside which every decision of the period was taken, and no honest account can omit it. It is also not a complete defense, because what Switzerland supplied in return had military value. Transit came first. Under the terms of the 1909 Gotthard Convention with Germany and Italy, a treaty the Confederation had signed to secure the tunnel's financing and international status, Switzerland was obliged to permit the passage of goods between the 2 countries. Through the war, freight moved between Germany and Italy along the line in substantial volume, coal southbound and Italian goods northbound, in quantities running to millions of tons across the period. The Swiss position was that the Hague rules prohibit the transit of troops and war materiel, but not ordinary commerce, and that the traffic was screened accordingly. Historians have questioned how rigorous the screening was, and the volume of coal alone, a strategic commodity by any definition, makes the distinction uncomfortable. Second was manufacturing. Swiss precision industry sold to Germany throughout the war, machine tools, timing devices, optical equipment, ball bearings, and munitions components. Some of it was made under trade agreements negotiated as the price of food imports. Some of it was straightforwardly profitable. The Allies applied counter-pressure through blockade and blacklisting, and the balance of Swiss exports shifted as the war turned, but the German trade never stopped entirely. Third, and most examined, was finance. The Swiss National Bank purchased gold from the German Reichsbank throughout the war, in amounts totaling well over £1 billion at the values of the time. A portion of that gold had been looted, taken from the central banks of occupied countries, and in a smaller but morally distinct quantity, taken from individuals, including victims of the camps. The Bergier Commission, an independent panel of historians appointed by the federal government in 1996 and reporting in 2002, concluded that Swiss officials had reason to suspect the origin of at least some of these purchases and continued regardless. Fourth was refugee policy, and this is the part of the record with the fewest available excuses. In 1938, Swiss authorities negotiated with Germany an arrangement under which the passports of German Jews would be marked with a stamp, a red letter, identifying the holder so that Swiss border officials could refuse entry without imposing a general visa requirement on all German citizens. The initiative for a distinguishing mark came from the Swiss side. in the person of Heinrich Rothmund, head of the police division. The purpose was explicitly to keep Jewish refugees out. In August 1942, with deportations from Western Europe underway and their nature increasingly known, the federal authorities closed the border to refugees fleeing on racial grounds, ruling that such flight did not constitute political asylum. The policy was justified publicly with the argument that the boat was full. Switzerland admitted a substantial number of refugees during the war. The total taken in over the period runs into the hundreds of thousands when internees, children, and temporary admissions are counted. It also turned back an estimated 24,000-odd civilian refugees at the frontier, many of whom were handed to the authorities they were fleeing. Individual Swiss acted against this. Paul Gruninger, the police commander of St. Gallen, falsified entry dates to admit several hundred Jewish refugees after the border closed. He was dismissed in 1939, prosecuted, fined, and stripped of his pension. He died in poverty in 1972. His conviction was annulled by a St. Gallen court in 1995, and the federal parliament passed a law providing for rehabilitation of those punished for helping refugees in 2003. The reckoning came slowly and largely under external pressure. The question of assets deposited in Swiss banks by people who were subsequently murdered, dormant accounts whose heirs could not produce the death certificates the banks required, became an international controversy in the 1990s. Class action litigation in the United States, congressional hearings, and the threat of sanctions against Swiss banks led in 1998 to a settlement of $1.25 billion. The Bergier Commission's final report followed, and it was not gentle about the conduct of banks, of industry, or of the federal government. Now, the balance, which is where restraint is required in both directions. The country was not occupied. It maintained its independence, its institutions, and its population intact through a war that destroyed both in most of Europe. Its army was mobilized for over 2,000 days. The Red Cross apparatus in Geneva operated throughout, and Swiss diplomats acted as the protecting power for a great many belligerent states, handling their interests and their prisoners in enemy territory, work that saved lives at scale and is documented in detail. And it is worth noting the specific failure, because it is instructive. The Eicher's decision not to make a public statement about the extermination of European Jews, debated internally in 1942 and resolved against, was defended at the time on the grounds that it would end the organization's access to prisoners of war. The Eichers has since acknowledged the choice as a moral failure. That is the shape of the ledger. A corridor confers leverage on whoever holds it, and leverage was what kept the country out of the war. But leverage is only worth something if it is used, and using it meant carrying freight for one side and buying its gold. Neutrality had never been a moral position. It was a bargain about a road, and in the 1940s, the terms of that bargain were laid out more plainly than in any previous century. What made the bargain enforceable was not the paperwork of 1815, which Germany had disregarded in Belgium in 1914 and again in 1940. It was the charges in the tunnel and the doctrine built around them. The doctrine had been forming since the 1880s, when Swiss staff officers first began to argue that a small state cannot defend a frontier against a great power and should not try. Their reasoning was demographic. The Northern Plateau, the belt of low country between the Jura and the Alps containing Zurich, Bern, Basel, the industry, the farmland, and the great majority of the population, is open ground with no natural barrier worth the name. Defending it against a modern army required forces the country could not raise. The alternative was to concede it and hold something that could actually be held. Fortification began accordingly. Fortresses were constructed at Saint-Maurice, commanding the Rhone Valley in the west, and around the Gotthard Massif in the center, from the 1880s onward. A third position at Sargans in the east, covering the upper Rhine approaches, was developed later. These 3 points formed a triangle enclosing the Central Alps, and each sat on a route that an invader would have to use. The doctrine that made sense of them was elaborated after June 1940 by Henri Guisan, elected general by the Federal Assembly the previous September, with a plan drafted principally by his chief of staff, Samuel Gotthard. The final version was adopted on the 12th of July 1940 and communicated to senior officers at the Rutley Meadow, the site associated with the Confederation's founding oath, on the 25th of July. The plan was as follows. Border forces would fight a delaying action and withdraw. The bulk of the army, eventually 8 infantry divisions and 3 mountain brigades, drawn from a mobilized strength that exceeded 430,000 men, would fall back into the Alpine Triangle. Supplies would be stockpiled inside for indefinite resistance, with no provision for further retreat, and the passes, tunnels, bridges, and viaducts would be destroyed. That last element was the entire argument. Consider what an invader would have gained. The plateau, with the cities and the factories, which would fall in days. What he would not have gained was the transit route, because it would no longer exist. Charges were placed in chambers cut into the tunnel linings and the bridge abutments, engineering that had been prepared in advance and could be executed in hours. A tunnel of that length, brought down at multiple points under 1.5 kilometers of mountain, is not repaired in wartime. It is not repaired in a decade. So the calculation presented to Berlin and Rome ran like this. An invasion secures a wrecked economy, an unbroken army in mountains that require enormous forces to clear, and the permanent loss of the freight artery between German industry and Italian ports. Leaving the country alone secures the artery in working order, plus manufactured goods, plus a functioning financial market. Guisan's address at the Rutley was not, contrary to popular memory, a speech to the nation broadcast in defiance. It was an order group for around 600 senior officers, at a location chosen for its symbolic weight, and its content was the operational plan. Its effect on morale was considerable, and its effect on German planning is harder to assess, because German intelligence certainly knew about the demolition preparations and drew conclusions from them. Operational plans for an invasion existed. The best known, drafted in the summer of 1940 under the designation Operation Tannenbaum, went through several iterations and was never executed. The reasons were multiple: the shift of German attention east, the absence of any pressing need, but the assessments consistently identified the same problem: the terrain and the demolitions. The Redoui had real costs, and they should be stated. It abandoned the majority of the population. The plan explicitly ceded the plateau, which meant that the families of the men in the mountains would be under occupation. This was understood at the time and was politically difficult. It also assumed a level of self-sufficiency in the redoubt that post-war analysis has questioned. The stockpiles were substantial but finite, and the calculation of how long resistance could actually be sustained was never tested. The physical scale of the construction was extraordinary. Artillery forts were cut into mountainsides, with gun positions concealed behind rock faces and disguised as chalets or barns. Fortress Fuchsegg, Fortress Sasso da Pigna beneath the pass summit, the works at Arolo and Andermatt and Gotthard. These were multi-level installations with barracks, hospitals, magazines, and generating plant, capable of holding garrisons for extended periods. Thousands of smaller bunkers and blockhouses were built across the approaches. The system did not end in 1945. It expanded. Through the Cold War, the redoubt doctrine was retained and adapted for a different threat. Bunkers were hardened against nuclear effects. Demolition chambers were maintained and extended to cover essentially every significant bridge and tunnel in the country, wired and inventoried, with the charges stored ready. Anti-tank obstacles, the concrete blocks known as Toblerone lines, after the chocolate they resemble, were laid across valley floors, and many are still there. Civil defense went further than anywhere else in the world. A federal law of 1963 required fallout shelter provision, and subsequent legislation required that new residential buildings include a shelter or that the owner contribute to a communal one. The result is a national shelter capacity exceeding the population, something in excess of 300,000 shelters, sufficient for more than 100% coverage, a distinction no other country holds. Universal male conscription continued, with men keeping their service rifle at home between refresher courses. The Army's mobilization system was designed to put several 100,000 men in the field within 48 hours. The whole apparatus is best understood as an extension of what Lecourbe demonstrated at the Broken Bridge in 1799, industrialized and applied to an entire country. The value of the terrain was never that it stopped armies. Armies had crossed it repeatedly. The value was that crossing it against opposition cost more than it was worth, and that the thing being fought for could be destroyed by the defender before it changed hands. Neutrality, in this reading, is not a moral stance or a legal category. It is the policy that a state adopts when it holds an asset that everyone wants, that everyone can be denied, and that is worth more to everyone intact than any of them could gain by seizing it. Switzerland spent the second half of the 20th century as the most heavily fortified country in Europe in order to remain the least involved in its conflicts. It joined the United Nations only in 2002, after a referendum, having declined membership in 1986 by a substantial margin. It has never joined a military alliance, and underneath all of it, the tunnel of 1882 kept working. By the 1970s, it was carrying more freight than its designers had imagined, on a line that still had to climb steep spiral approaches to reach the portals, because Favre's bore, deep as it was, still ran high through the mountain rather than beneath it. The corridor had one more transformation left. The problem that remained was the one Favre had solved only partially. His tunnel pierced the massif at around 1,150 meters above sea level, which meant trains still had to climb roughly 700 meters from the valley floor to reach it, and they did so on spiral loops cut into the mountainside, curling back through the rock to gain height without exceeding the gradient a locomotive could manage. Those loops are among the more admired pieces of 19th century railway engineering, and they are also a permanent tax on capacity. Heavy freight needed banking locomotives. Trains ran shorter and slower than the flat lines on either side. By the 1980s, the consequence was arriving in a form nobody had anticipated: lorries. Road freight had grown enormously since the road tunnel opened in 1980, and the volume crossing the Alps by lorry was rising towards 1 million vehicles a year, with the associated effects on air quality and noise in the Alpine valleys. The Swiss response was characteristic. In February 1994, a popular initiative to protect the Alpine region from transit traffic was put to referendum and passed. It obliged the Confederation to shift transalpine freight from road to rail, and it wrote the requirement into the Constitution. Fulfilling it required a tunnel that did not climb at all. The project approved by referendum in 1992 and financed by a further vote in 1998 was designed as a base tunnel, bored at valley level, entering at Erstfeld in the north at around 460 meters, and emerging at Bodio in the south at around 312, with a summit inside the mountain barely above either portal. Trains would pass beneath the massif on a line essentially flat, with a maximum gradient far below anything a climbing route could offer. The length required was 57 kilometers. Construction ran from 1999 to 2016, and at its deepest, the bore lies beneath roughly 2,300 meters of rock, where the undisturbed temperature exceeds 45 degrees and required industrial cooling plant to make the working faces habitable. The geology was the adversary, as it had been for Favre. 4 tunnel boring machines, each several hundred meters long, worked with drill and blast crews in the sections where the rock was too broken or too soft for a machine. The Piora zone, a band of sugary dolomite that engineers had feared would be waterlogged and unstable, was investigated by exploratory drilling for years before the route was committed. 9 workers died over the 17 years of construction. That figure, set beside the toll of the 1870s, is the clearest single measure of what changed between the two projects. The tunnel opened on the 1st of June 2016, the same calendar date, 134 years later, as Favre's. Passenger services began in December. The crossing that had taken a week by mule, 9 hours by the first railway, now takes about 20 minutes underground. Consider what the sequence amounts to. A wooden ledge bolted to a cliff around 1230, a blasted hole of 60 meters in 1707, a bore of 15 kilometers in 1882, a bore of 57 kilometers, flat, in 2016. Each solved the same problem, which is that the shortest line between Northern Europe and the Lombard Plain runs through granite, and each solved it by removing more of the mountain than the last. What survives of the older corridor survives as heritage and as landscape. The cobbled hairpins of the Tremola are a protected monument, closed to through traffic and walked by tourists. Moratini's tunnel is still in use, widened repeatedly, carrying the local road. The stone bridge of 1595 stands ruined beside its successors in the gorge, and a mural of a devil holding a goat looks down on all three from the rock face, painted in 1950 and relocated in 1961 when the motorway needed the space. A monument to the Russian dead of 1799 was cut into the granite nearby in 1898, on land ceded to Russia for the purpose. The fortifications have had a stranger afterlife. The Réduit works were progressively decommissioned from the 1990s as the threat they were built for disappeared. Sasso da Pigna, the artillery fort beneath the pass, opened to the public in 2012 as a museum. Others were sold. Several have been converted into data centers, on the logic that a bunker built to survive artillery is an excellent place to keep servers, and that a country with a reputation for discretion is an attractive jurisdiction in which to keep other people's information. The demolition chambers in the bridges and tunnels have largely been emptied. The neutrality itself remains, and remains contested. In 2022, the federal government adopted the European Union's sanctions against Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, and continue to prohibit the re-export of Swiss-made materiel to Ukraine by third countries. Both decisions drew serious domestic criticism from opposite directions. One camp holding that sanctions breached neutrality, the other that refusing arms transfers made neutrality a shield for aggression. A popular initiative to write a stricter definition into the Constitution has been advanced. The argument is live and unresolved. What can be said is that the thing being argued about has always been more specific than the word suggests. It began as a rule that no valley could make separate deals about a road. It became a deadlock between confessions that could agree on nothing else. It was written into European law in 1815 because 6 powers preferred an empty space in the Alps to a rival occupying it. It was enforced by charges in tunnel linings, and it was profitable throughout, in ways that the record of the 1940s makes plain. Herodotus observed that human prosperity never remains long in the same place, and the passes are a reminder of how much the location of prosperity depends on where the rock happens to be soft enough to cut. The Great St. Bernard, which carried Roman legions and imperial coronation processions, now carries local traffic and a hospice with dogs. The route that carried nothing for 1,000 years, because 3 kilometers of gorge could not be walked, carries a substantial share of the freight moving between Northern Europe and Italy. Standing at Schöllenen today, the whole sequence is visible at once. The motorway portal, the base tunnel line, Favre's older bore, the road climbing towards the gorge, and above all of it the granite that made every one of them necessary. 4 solutions to a single obstacle, stacked in the same few hundred meters of valley, built by people who kept concluding that the mountain was in the way, and kept deciding to go through it anyway. If this kind of history interests you, infrastructure as the hidden argument beneath politics, and the specific engineering that decides which nations get to exist, subscribe and let us know in the comments which corridor you would like examined next.